Thanks, Maurice, and thank you all. It's great to be back here. If you can believe it, I arrived on this campus 57 years ago. It was only the second time I'd been out of New England. You know, in those days, you didn't get on a plane and go places. I didn't know a Shaker from a Quaker. I had no idea what this was all about. But they were 4 very important years of my life, folks. And I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that my decision to pursue a career in public service had a lot to do with this place. So that was back in the early 50s. There was a fellow named Joseph R. McCarthy running around the country questioning people's loyalty, the kind of anti-communist hysteria that we lived through during that period was not fun, but it was a very formative influence in my life. I didn't like McCarthy. I didn't like what he was doing. It's not an exaggeration to say that Joe McCarthy probably had as much to do as anybody with convincing me that guys like me and others ought to get deeply and actively involved in the political life of our community and our state and our country. Marie skipped over the fact that I was a candidate for the presidency in 1988. And as I said to a class of political science students just a few minutes ago, I owe you all an apology. If I'd beaten old man Bush, you'd have never heard of his kid, and we wouldn't be in this mess. So it's all my fault. Which is one of the reasons why I feel so strongly about this election. Now, if you want to get into that in the Q&A, I'll be happy to get into it with you. But since it is Constitution Day, let me unburden myself of a few ideas on the subject of the American Constitution. To begin with, while all of you who have studied American history know that the Constitution was a remarkable document in many ways, it was in many ways profoundly undemocratic. Now, it was probably as democratic as anything we had seen up until that time. But the framers of the Constitution were very, very skeptical about the ability of ordinary citizens to exercise the franchise. In fact, only about 10 or 15% of the U.S. population could vote in the early national elections. If you were a woman, ladies, you couldn't vote. If you were a person of color, you couldn't vote. And if you were a white guy without sufficient amounts of property, you couldn't vote. And even with this very restricted electorate, the framers did not trust these white guys with property to vote directly for the presidency. And so they created something called the Electoral College, which was designed really to make it possible for people like them to decide who the President of the United States would be. We still have this institution. We should have gotten rid of it a century and a half ago. We saw what happened in 2000, and frankly, to be perfectly bipartisan, had John Kerry beaten George Bush by 1 vote in Ohio, he would have been the President of the United States, even though Bush got the popular vote. And who knows what's going to happen 6 weeks from now. My own view is that it's time to get rid of the thing. By the way, any of you know who the last president was who seriously went out to get rid of the Electoral College? This will test you. You know the answer to this question, you don't have to take the final. Anybody know? Anybody want to guess? No. A little more recent than that. Richard Milhous Nixon was the last president to actively and aggressively pursue the abolition of the Electoral College. Did so in 1969 after he and Humphrey and George Wallace were involved. And Wallace, at least there was a threat that Wallace's vote might throw the thing into the House of Representatives. Got an overwhelming vote to abolish in the House, 330 to 70, something like that. Went to the Senate. What happened? Well, a bunch of white, Southern, racist, so-called Democrats, call themselves Democrats at the time, who controlled the Senate, and for that matter, the House in many ways, though not on this vote, filibustered the thing to death. And by the way, we still have this filibuster rule, which has been modified a bit, but effectively makes the Senate of the United States one of the few parliamentary bodies in the world where a majority of the members can't, after reasonable debate, vote on an issue. And by the way, both the Democrats and Republicans have abused this thing. Now it's the Republicans. You can't get 60 votes. You can't get a bill through the Senate. Anybody here from California? Only the California legislature is a place where you need a 2/3 vote to pass a budget or increase a tax. But as parliamentary bodies go, I think I'm correct in saying that the Senate of the United States is the only place where a simple majority, after reasonable debate, cannot act. Do that in the House, do it in any legislative body. When I was in the Massachusetts legislature, if we had debate and it was droning on for 3 or 4 or 5 hours, all you had to do was stand up at your desk in the legislative chamber, say, Mr. Speaker, I move the question. It wasn't debatable, wasn't amendable, and you had to have a vote. And if a majority of the members of the House had decided they had heard enough, we could go to a vote. Can't do that in the Senate. And unless the Democrats elect 60 United States senators in this election, which is possible but not likely, so that they can then override the filibuster of the effort to change the rule, we're still going to have a situation, even if Obama is elected and we get 56, 57, 58 Democratic senators, where unless you can persuade a handful of Republicans to come over, the Senate is paralyzed to act, which doesn't make a lot of sense to me. So while that's not really a function of the Constitution, it has more to do with the rules of the Senate. It's another very important reform, it seems to me, in our constitutional system. If we're going to have a Congress, legislative body, that can respond to the kinds of challenges that we face. But the single most important threat, in my judgment, folks, to what is really unique about the United States Constitution, and that is the Bill of Rights, is the use of the argument that we can play fast and loose with the Bill of Rights in the interests of national security. And we've seen this over and over again in American history. Abraham Lincoln was a great man, but suspended the writ of habeas corpus and essentially played fast and loose with that set of rights because he argued it was justified by the Civil War. Shortly after World War I, a graduate of this institution, I regret to say, who was the Attorney General of the United States under Woodrow Wilson, began what was known as a series of what were called Palmer raids, in which people accused of sedition, we don't hear that word these days, anarchists, Bolsheviks, Reds, found themselves in their homes being invaded, arrested, incarcerated. I come from a state where Sacco and Vanzetti were convicted unfairly and were put to death. They were guilty of the crimes for which they had been charged, but because they were Italian anarchists who were considered dangerous and radical. And one of the nice things about being governor is that every once in a while you can redress some of these wrongs. And I was very proud to be able to issue a proclamation on the 50th anniversary in 1977 of the execution of Sacco and Vanzetti, saying a terrible injustice had been done, and it was time to acknowledge that. I couldn't pardon them posthumously because I just didn't have the authority to do that. There was a Republican state senator in Massachusetts who called for my impeachment as a result of that, but I still feel pretty good about that. But post-World War I, Attorney General of the United States, engaging in serious violations of people's Bill of Rights under the Bill of Rights in the interests of national security. We saw it during World War II, when 120,000 Japanese Americans were incarcerated in concentration camps, which we euphemistically called relocation camps, in the interests of national security, under an executive order issued by Franklin Delano Roosevelt and subsequently approved by the Supreme Court of the United States. And many of these folks were American citizens, ripped out of their homes, ripped out of their communities, given 48 hours to pack one bag and to get out a truck to be shipped to a so-called relocation camp. Bob Matsui, one of the best people I've ever met, one of the first congressmen outside of New England who endorsed me, a Japanese American, was just a kid when this happened. Parents lived in Sacramento. They sold their house for $50 because that's all they could get for it, as they were told to get out of Sacramento, get on a truck, and go to one of these camps. It's remarkable. 120,000 Americans. Why? Because they happen to be of Japanese descent. And we saw it again during the McCarthy period. And we're seeing it again, folks. The use of torture as an instrument of American foreign policy in the interests of national security. I don't know how many of you listened to Governor Palin's acceptance speech at the convention. We're serious about the terrorists. They want to read them their rights. That's what she said. Doesn't believe in the Constitution, doesn't believe in the Bill of Rights, doesn't believe that criminal defendants, no matter how heinous the crimes for which they've been charged, have the right to defend themselves, to have counsel. All of those kinds of things which most of us assume as a matter of right were guaranteed by the Constitution of the United States. So the price of freedom is eternal vigilance, and particularly when it comes to protecting the Constitution. And quite frankly, I think this is a major issue in this campaign. I don't think there's any question that there's a huge difference of opinion between these two presidential candidates and their running mates, I might add, when it comes to this fundamental issue. Not the issue of national security, but the question of how we protect our national security without doing violence to these very, very precious rights that over time have been fought for. And you've got to understand, even in the early 50s when I came here, what this country was like, folks. I mean, we were running around the world telling people that we were the leader of the free world, as we called it, fighting against godless communism as represented by the Soviet Union. But when I came to this campus in 1951, this country was racist, it was anti-Semitic. We had a handful of black students here. They couldn't get their haircuts in the barbershop in Swarthmore because they were black. And never wanted to pass up an opportunity to combine my commitment to social justice with economic opportunity. I became the campus barber. Used to cut hair almost every night on the 3rd floor of Wharton Hall. I only had one style. Those days it was short. And my customers complained that they had to listen to my political line while I was waving the clippers and the scissors around their ears. But we boycotted the barbershops in Swarthmore in the early 50s, long before the sit-ins, until finally one of those 3 barbers, a survivor of the Holocaust named Adolf Rubin, said, look, I know what discrimination is all about, and I'll cut these kids' hair. But by that time, I'd kind of captured the market. And so for 4 years, I was in pretty good shape. I was an inveterate hitchhiker in my youth. And during spring vacations, I and one of my buddies would take off someplace. I'd never been in the South. One of these vacations, I and my pal ended up in New Orleans. Those days, you got on a bus in New Orleans, you were black, you went to the back of the bus. If you were black and you lived in Washington, D.C., the capital of the so-called free world, you went to the back of the bus. You didn't eat in restaurants. Schools of Washington, D.C. in the 1950s were segregated by act of Congress. Well, we got on a bus in New Orleans, and there was a kind of wooden sign, and I can't remember what it said, something like colored only behind the sign. And if that section was filling up and you didn't, or the front section was filling up and you didn't have enough and you were white, you were supposed to take the sign, which had 2 metal spikes, pull it from the bar at the top of the bus seat and stick it in the bar of the seat behind us so that there was always this sign between you and those black folks. Well, my buddy and I, another Swarthmore student, decided we'd strike a blow for freedom. And so when the bus driver wasn't looking, we took the thing and stuck it in our bag and brought it back to Swarthmore. I don't know whether the New Orleans bus company ever found out about it. But that was the world that we lived in the early 50s when I was here on this campus. There was a story, and I think it was a true story, about somebody who went to the Suburban Train station, we used to call it in Philadelphia, to get a ticket, I think to media, and said, I want a ticket to media. The guy said, that's the stop after Moscow. That was us. That was Swarthmore. Ludicrous. And in 1955, when I left this place and was drafted in the military and went to Fort Dix, New Jersey for my first 8 weeks of basic training, the second day that I was there, I had what passes for a personnel interview, at least passed for a personnel interview in those days, a young personnel specialist, another draftee, who presumably interviewed me and then made recommendations as to what specialty or area of specialization I would go into as a young draftee. And he said, gee, this is interesting. He said, he's looking at my file. He said, you were the president of the Students for Democratic Action at Swarthmore. How was that, he said. Now, I was succeeded as president of the Students for Democratic Action by a fellow named Karl Rove, who's now the senior United States Senator. But in those days, you could get into trouble in the military if you had been associated with some of these liberal groups. He said, I see you ran a membership drive for the Civil Liberties Union on the Swarthmore campus. I did. We signed up 1 out of every 3 people on the campus, members of the ACLU. This was in my file the second day I arrived at Fort Dix as a young, nondescript draftee. And I had a very good friend, a guy named Jonathan Fine, who had graduated from Swarthmore the year before me, also from my hometown of Massachusetts, who was held for months in a kind of administrative limbo at Fort Dix after doing his basic training because he'd been a member of something called the United World Federalists, which was an organization advocating a very strong UN and international law and those kinds of things, and came that close to being discharged other than honorably because he'd been a member of that organization. Think about it, folks. Another example of what was happening to our civil liberties as a result of the argument that we had to protect ourselves against threats and maybe folks who engaged in this kind of political activity, perfectly lawful, by the way, didn't belong in the military. So we've come a long way, but we've gone through a period now where, once again, the argument is being made that you can play fast and loose with these constitutional rights because national security demands it. Don't you believe it. Don't you let it happen. I hope that many of you in this place today will think seriously about careers in public service. I mean that. I hope many of you will run for elective office, as Karl and I did, and other Swarthmore graduates have done. If you don't want to run for elective office, then train yourself as a first-rate public servant, because guys like me who run for elective office are looking for talented people who can make things happen in the public sector. But get involved in public service at whatever level makes sense to you. I started in municipal government, about as low in the totem pole as you could possibly get. And while I regret very much that I lost that election in 1988, I'll tell you, I wouldn't swap my life for anybody's. And I'm still involved. I teach full-time, which itself is a form of public service, an important one. And I spend a lot of time trying to encourage my students to go into public service, help them develop the skills they need to do public service. But don't let anybody tell you that you can't play an important role in the future of this country in some way, in some form. And while race is still an issue in this country, and we still have to deal with it, the fact that the two leading, and gender for that matter, the fact that the two leading candidates for the Democratic nomination, the first time in history, happened to be a woman and an African American, I think tells you something. Now, this election is going to be a huge test. Not just about race, but partly about race. Whether or not this country is ready to elect a really extraordinary African American as President of the United States. And it's going to be interesting to see, and the race issue, I suspect, will cut both ways. But you know, When I first ran for the legislature in Massachusetts, back in 1962, it was inconceivable that a Greek American could be elected governor of Massachusetts. Not because people didn't like us. I mean, I think the Greeks there aren't enough of us to threaten anybody. But it was just inconceivable in the ethnic politics of the time. I mean, a guy named Dukakis. 20 years later, there was a Greek in the governor's office. That was me. We had a Greek American United States Senator. That was Paul Tsongas. We had a Greek congressman named Nick Marvoulis. And my Speaker of the House of Massachusetts was an Armenian American, even more inconceivable. So I think it tells you something. Still a long way to go here. But race, ethnicity, look, before long, this country is going to be majority nothing. Far more diverse than we've ever been before. And I think that's a good thing. But you guys in particular, I think, have great opportunities out there ahead of you. Don't let anybody tell you that you can't participate fully and actively in the political life of this country. And we need you, let me tell you, at every level. As some of you know, I'm obsessive on the subject of precinct-based grassroots organizing. If Obama's going to win this thing, he's got to organize every precinct in this country, and I hope he will. But that's where I started. I started as a precinct captain. I started as a member, as you heard Maurice say, of what we call the representative town meeting in my town, running from a precinct, 3,000 voters, 1,500 households, rang every doorbell. Did the same when I ran for the legislature. Did the same when I ran for governor. Regret to say I didn't do a very good job at the grassroots in 1988, and don't ask me why. Which is one of the reasons why I think I'm so sensitive about this. But there are great opportunities out there for you guys, and I hope you will never regret it. As I said to the class that I spoke to a few minutes ago, plan to live moderately. If you want to get rich, don't go into politics, and have a good but conventional sex life. I mean, as we're being reminded every day. But I don't want you to think it's an occupational disease for politicians. It really isn't. I couldn't wait to get home at night. So, what can I tell you? And I'll just tell you one quick story of myself and then open things up because I'm sure you've got lots of questions. I was mic'd up for this. And I guess I could walk around. Can I? Can you hear me? Oh, okay. And it happened to be the day, anybody here from Chicago? There's a large Irish-American population in Chicago. Is it not? Richard Daley is a longtime mayor. And they have a St. Patrick's Day parade, as we do in Boston. It's a big event. It was the week before the Boston parade. And I hadn't seen Kitty in about 4 or 5 days. Now, I'm married to an exceedingly attractive woman. And she happened to have this beautiful Irish-made green cape that I used to love, and she looked terrific in it. And my wife's a quarter Irish, so it kind of goes with her. And all of a sudden, there she was. Now, I had forgotten that either CNN or C-SPAN had mic'd me for the day. And that's another tip for you. Don't let them do that because you forget you're mic'd. So I went up to her and I gave her a big hug. And I said, look, because I knew after the parade I was going to go out and do some speaking, and she was going to go out and do speaking for me. I said, if I'm asleep when you get back tonight at the hotel, wake me up. And I went on to say a few other things. All of which went out over the airwaves. And was picked up by our younger daughter, who happened to be a freshman at Brown. She called me up the next day. She said, Dad, it was so embarrassing. Don't let them mic you up. Anyway, questions, thoughts, reactions, fire away. We got about a half an hour. And I guess you're just going to have to shout, and I'll kind of repeat the question stuff. Who's questions? Yeah. What about race in this presidential campaign? Well, my own feeling is it's going to kind of balance off a little bit. Will there be some people that will vote against Obama because he happens to be an African American? Probably. There were people that I assume voted against me because I had a funny name, you know. In fact, there was a, what was the name of that gal in 1988? It was, Maurice, do you remember, who was a country singer? Said, what kind of a name, who would ever vote for a guy with a name like Dukakis? Who was that? She was with Bush, I can't remember. Right? Anyway, on the other hand, there will be people voting for him because he's African American. Some of these folks may be African American, some may be people who like him and at the same time think it's about time that the United States elected somebody talented and somebody, a person of color. Now, I can tell you this, the Obama campaign is working like fury to register young people and African Americans. And I think there's a reason for that. And most of the African Americans I know these days are very proud of him, even as Greek Americans are very proud of me, and for obvious reasons. So I think it will cut both ways. If the Obama campaign is doing the job at the grassroots, he's going to win. He's going to win. I don't care, race or whatever. That is absolutely key. And that's why I feel so strongly about this grassroots stuff. But I think in the last analysis, it probably will balance off a bit on both sides. You know, have we solved our race problems in this country? Hardly, folks. Certainly not. I don't have to tell you that. Have we made progress since the early 50s, when black kids couldn't get a haircut in the Ville? I hope so. I hope so. We've got a long way to go, but the fact that we're at this point in time, and this guy has got a very good chance of getting elected, I think says something about the progress we've made. And if he is elected, I don't think there's any question it will be a huge, huge step forward. Questions? Questions? Yeah. Look, the reality is that you now have this incredible array of media of all kinds. It's electronic, it's the internet, it's television, it's 24-hour cable, it's print, although people are reading newspapers less and less. At the risk of sounding monotonous, I said to my students the other day, I hate to sound like a broken record. Nobody knows what I was talking about. You guys know what a broken record is? No. I have no idea what I was talking about. Anyway. One of the reasons I'm so obsessive about grassroots organizing is because I think it is absolutely the best way to communicate directly with people, especially with all this noise. And if anything, old-fashioned, precinct-based grassroots organizing and campaigning is even more important today because of all the background noise and the media stuff. You know, Palin, bingo, for a week and a half, it's wall-to-wall Palin. Then things begin to, you know, the air starts coming out of the balloon, and it turns out she's the national queen of earmarks, and, you know, she was for the bridge, and all this kind of stuff, and things begin to kind of settle down a little bit. But, you know, that's the nature of the modern media. As a candidate, you have to deal with that. I did a lousy job of dealing with it. Unfortunately, my former lieutenant governor and my pal Kerry also did a lousy job of dealing with it. You've got to be ready for it. Is the Obama campaign ready for it? Yeah. I mean, take a look at Obama's speech after the night of the North Carolina primary. I mean, he laid out exactly, he said, this is what they're going to try to do to us. And that's exactly what the McCain campaign, you know, John McCain, who, I don't know what's happened to the old McCain, to tell you the truth. I mean that. I mean that. You know, the John McCain that voted against tax cuts for the rich and worked with Ted Kennedy to come up with a responsible immigration bill and was savaged by Karl Rove and Bush in South Carolina in the 2000 primary. Now has hired a Rove protege to run his campaign, and we're getting a Rove-type campaign. Well, if you're Obama, and if you're all of us who are with him, then you got to deal with that. You just can't say life is unfair, and isn't this terrible, and why are they saying those things, and they're untrue, and all that kind of stuff. You got to deal with it. You got to deal with it at the media level, as he is. I mean, there isn't a McCain attack ad that isn't responded to by the Obama campaign where they are being run within 24 hours. But again, I cannot emphasize to you enough the importance of having an army of committed folks at the precinct level who live, look like, walk, and talk like the precinct. I want you guys involved in this, but having some kid from 1,000 miles away knocking on somebody's door in Pennsylvania doesn't do it. These have got to be folks in the neighborhood. But, you know, Obama does have 2.5 million contributors. Every one of those contributors ought to be asked to work a precinct right away, right away. Every precinct in the country. Only 200,000 precincts, 2.5 million contributors. Sounds like a pretty good pool of people from which to, but that's the way I think in the last analysis. And this means not only going up and knocking on people's doors, but having conversations with them, coming back, answering their questions. What concerns you? What do you, well, somebody told me he was a Muslim. You know, he won't salute the flag. I mean, all this nonsense. There's nothing like somebody in your neighborhood and saying, hey, or, you know, where is he on health care? Going to be around the next couple of hours? I'll bring you something. Bang, over the computer. Don't need to pay for literature anymore these days, folks. Just hit the computer. Up comes Obama on health care. Back you go. Here's something, take a look at it. I'll check back with you. You know how important that is to people? It doesn't happen to them these days. McCain has no field operation, none. It's all up here. It's all media. Our advantage, Obama's advantage, it seems to me, is that he's got a very broad base of people who are committed to him. But it's very important in the next 6 weeks that those people be out systematically connecting at the neighborhood level. And this is not just talking to your friends. This is every household, Republicans, Democrats, Independents. I don't care who they are. That goes a long way toward dealing with a lot of this media stuff. Who's next? Yeah. What about special interests, the wealthy, the powerful? Don't they have a disproportionate influence? It has always been thus. This is always the contest, folks. Those of you who go into elective office, and I hope many of you will, you're going to find that all the time. I mean, the first decision you've got to make is, how am I going to raise my campaign money? It's the first decision you make. It's really very easy to walk into some hotel room and pick up a $5,000 check from a political action committee. No heavy lifting, right? But that political action committee is looking for something. Now, I never took PAC money, not because I'm holier than anybody else. I understood what was going on. So I always raised my money from a very broad base of relatively small contributors. No internet in those days. But in my gubernatorial races, normally I'd have 70,000 to 75,000 contributors, who, of course, I'd try to turn into precinct workers. And I remember when I ran in this famous rematch with the guy that beat me in '78, or he's back in '82. I think the average contribution in those days was about $50, and I had about 70,000. But that's $3.5 million. Back in 1982, that was more than enough to finance a good campaign. But notice, I had all the independence in the world because I wouldn't take PAC money. Lobbyists, no dice. I was like Obama, isn't it? No lobbyists. No money from lobbyists, no fundraising by lobbyists. And again, you know, it's not because he's Mr. Goody Two-Shoes or I was. We understand, I mean, you understand the consequences. And I would argue that if you raise your money that way, then you develop the kind of base which makes it possible for you to do the grassroots stuff. In other words, you turn your contributors into grassroots activists at the same time that they're contributing. But you start with that. Now, if you're elected to public office, then you got to deal with this. On the other hand, you know, we should have been under no illusions about the kind of administration that George Bush was going to run, because he told us, didn't he? He told us he was going to cut taxes for the wealthy. His campaign was loaded with special interests. So's McCain's. I mean, ever since McCain, who, by the way, strongly opposed offshore drilling for years, decided he was for it, and it will not make a particle of difference in the price of gasoline now or ever, folks. It's a fraud. But as soon as that happened, I mean, a couple of $1 million poured in from the oil industry. Okay, that's the choice you got to make. But it all starts with your own sense of integrity and so on. But believe me, let me say this to you. I mean, if you go back to the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, there will be people who tell you I was a great governor. There will be people who tell you I was a lousy governor. I don't think anybody will tell you that we didn't set high standards of integrity and try to live by them. And in the last analysis, folks, that's the most important thing of all. But you got to set some standards for yourself, for the people around you, for your campaigns, for the folks who you select to work with you. And unless you do that, you run the risk of getting pushed around by these special interests. But it's always been there. Those of you who are students of American history, in the late 19th century, the Credit Mobilier scandal, the railroads owned the Congress, lock, stock, and barrel. I mean, they were dishing out railroad stock to members of Congress. You know, on the other hand, don't let anybody tell you that you can't set high standards of integrity and live by them and be an effective public servant. You can, but you've got to know what those standards are, and you've got to set them early, and you've got to live by them. And you sleep at night. And you can have a terrific career in public service at the same time. Yeah. How we deal with immigration? Well, serious problem, folks. Look, if you're going to have laws, they've got to be enforced. I mean, you just can't say, well, we're going to limit the number of immigrants, which I think probably makes sense. Although, quite frankly, my parents came here at a time when there was unlimited immigration. You know, by 1924, the door had been shut, not especially on, but for a number of ethnic groups, including Southern Europeans, Greeks, Italians, those guys, you know? But there was also, the 1924 Act was just racist through and through, this national quota system and so on and so forth. But if you are going to have limits, then they've got to be enforced. And one of the things that happened in 1986 was that we passed an Immigration Act which was designed to put principal responsibility on employers when it came to illegal immigrants, but we didn't give the employers the tools they needed to be able to verify whether or not these folks were legal or illegal. And anybody could have told you that when that law was passed without those kinds of tools, the only thing it would do was produce a terrific green card counterfeiting industry, which we now have. You can get one for $50, right? Now, how we deal with this is obviously something that the next Congress and the next president are going to have to deal with. And as I say, the old John McCain stepped up courageously, worked with Ted Kennedy, worked with the administration. Bush was pretty good on this, to try to develop this concept of earned citizenship. Look, we're not going to send 12 million people back. But it got caught up in this anti-immigrant thing, largely on the conservative side, and McCain himself has caved on the issue. Now, there's a special problem when it comes to skilled workers. But here it gets a little dicey. I mean, we now have, what, over 6% unemployment. Millions of Americans can't find work. And yet, the high-tech companies say, if you don't let us bring in folks from other places, we can't fill these. Well, what the hell is going on in the United States? I mean, don't we have a higher education system that's capable of training engineers and scientists and others? I mean, I think it's a confession of failure, to tell you the truth. And these are $80,000, $90,000, and $100,000 jobs out there in Silicon Valley and other places. What's the matter with us? So I'm not a big fan of liberalizing, what do they call them, those H-2 visas or whatever. I want to see us working hard with kids, especially inner city kids and other kids who have never had a shot at these kinds of things, to train them as scientists. You know, we have an area right next to Northeastern University in Boston. Any Bostonians here, Massachusetts folks? Melanie Cass Boulevard, you know where that is? No? Never been there? Roxbury. Okay. It's ideal as a biotech corridor. I and a bunch of people have been working on that. Now, a little difficult to get those biotech folks into Roxbury, but we've got some biotech companies there. You put biotech in Roxbury, and those kids in the 4th, 5th, and 6th grade begin doing field trips to those biotech companies, and then they begin to see, hey, this looks interesting. And pretty soon they're interested in science careers. Why aren't we doing that? Not just in Boston, but in other places. So I want to be kind of tough on the H-2 stuff, only because I see huge opportunities here for young Americans, especially young Americans who've been denied these kinds of opportunities. And it seems to me it's a bit of a cop-out to say, well, we can't find them, can't train them, they're not around, you know. Reminds me of what happened in the old days when, you know, the state police in Alabama had 800 troopers, and they were all white. When the commandant was sued by the NAACP, he said, well, I'm looking, but I can't find anybody. Any of you know what the federal district court judge did in that case? He was a Republican from northern Alabama, Frank Johnson, appointed by Dwight Eisenhower, of all people. He said, okay, folks, from now on, for every white trooper you hire, you're going to hire a black trooper. Until the percentage of black troopers in the Alabama State Police is roughly equal to the percentage of African Americans in the population. You get down to Alabama today. Lots of black troopers. Isn't that amazing? But you got to make the effort. And I'm a little concerned about the H-2 visas kind of giving us an excuse for not doing the hard work of making it possible for a lot of kids. Kids who deserve that kind of opportunity to develop careers in science and engineering, that kind of stuff. Who's next? Yeah. Where? Princeton?
Princeton, Massachusetts.
My God, only you and I know where Princeton, Massachusetts is. Democrats were using the filibuster to stop lousy Bush judicial appointments, right? And we all said, right on, yeah. But now the shoe is on the other foot, and thanks to the filibuster rule, we can't get anything done in the Senate. I'm sorry. I believe that a parliamentary body like the United States Senate ought to be able to vote after reasonable debate without 40 members of the Senate stopping them from doing so. And I agree with you. Democrats have sinned as much as Republicans on this. However, and I hope I'm not being too defensive, generally speaking, the Democrats were at least selective. I mean, it was a lousy judicial appointment, or at least somebody they thought was lousy. Now, Republicans are using this every single time there's a piece of legislation before the Congress. Unless you can somehow get it into the budget, which is not filibusterable. There is such a word. They're stopping everything. And I think that's a mistake. I mean, if the American people in their wisdom want a substantial Democratic majority in the Senate, then they ought to be able to get action. If they want a substantial Republican majority in the Senate, even if I happen to disagree with those folks, they ought to be able to get it after reasonable debate. That's what happens in the House, you know. They have reasonable debate, it can be limited, and then there's a vote. The same thing ought to happen in the Senate. Now, originally, 1/3 of the Senate could stop it. And when Lyndon Johnson was elected in 1964 with a large majority, Democratic majority, plus some, they modified the rule so that 60% could close debate, not 66 2/3 or 67 or whatever it was. But I don't buy that. I think after a reasonable amount of debate, a majority of the members of the Senate, just as we could in the Massachusetts legislature, ought to be able to say, okay, time for a vote. Get the votes. If you can't get the votes, too bad, you're going to lose. But right now, Republicans are using this every single time a Democratic bill comes before, which is one of the reasons why people are so frustrated. They say, well, why doesn't the Congress do anything? If you don't change this rule, you're going to have a tough time doing anything in that Congress, particularly if that filibuster rule is used every single time to stop legislation. Now, that's what's happening, Frank. Yeah. Yes. Let me see if I can rephrase it. Bush attacked me for being soft on crime. We had a furlough program in Massachusetts, actually started by a Republican governor. I had actually tightened it up substantially. A fellow named Willie Horton, who happened to be an African-American, was out on furlough, brutally raped a white woman, and that became one of the great issues of the campaign. But the fault was mine, quite frankly, because here's the Democratic candidate who comes from Massachusetts and Greater Boston. The Republican candidate comes from Houston. The homicide rate in Houston in 1988 was 6 times the homicide rate in Boston. And I couldn't make the case for being tougher on crime than Bush. That was my fault, folks. Now, it just so happened that the most liberal furlough program in America in 1988 was the Reagan-Bush furlough program in the federal prison system. I didn't say that. Not very smart. I mean, the guy's hitting me for having a furlough program. And by the way, they had furloughees out doing crazy things. One of them went out and murdered a young pregnant mother in the Southwest. Ronald Reagan had a furlough program, which he defended in California, too. His furloughees went out and murdered people while on furlough. I never said that. Look. Why? Well, I had made this decision. I wasn't going to respond to the attack campaign. It was just a terrible mistake. You can't let people do that. So I'll take the blame for that. Now, is McCain trying to do this to Obama, not on the crime issue, I don't think. I haven't heard, I haven't heard that. It's other stuff. He's going to raise everybody's taxes. That's a lie. That's a bald-faced lie. The only taxes that are going to be raised are taxes that were cut on the super rich. And I'm for that. I mean, you know, we're looking at a deficit of $500 billion, folks. In case you forgot that when Bill Clinton left office, we had a surplus and we were seriously talking about paying off the entire national debt in 10 years. Alan Greenspan was concerned. No national debt, how can the Federal Reserve function? Well, they can print money. Where's this money? By the way, where's all this money coming from? To bail out all these Wall Street firms. Now it's AIG. Where's it all coming from? Where are the economists in the place? I think they're just printing it, aren't they? I'm serious. But we're on our way to dramatic reductions. By the way, have you folks got any idea how much we now have to appropriate and spend every year just to service the national debt, which has doubled under Bush? About $400 billion a year. That's money that could be spent on infrastructure, on schools, on health care. We're spending it to pay off a debt because we didn't have the guts either to tax ourselves to pay it, or better still, not to invade Iraq and spend billions and billions of dollars. That war will cost us $1 trillion, $2 trillion, who knows, folks. By the time we've cared for thousands and thousands of young Americans who've come back from that war, brain injuries, amputees, traumatic injuries, I mean, the cost will be unbelievable. So, back to your question, my fault. There's no reason under the sun why I should have let Bush use the soft on crime thing on me. It was just a mistake, I'm sorry to say. And it's simply a reminder that you cannot let the other side, unfortunately, do that without having a very carefully thought out strategy for dealing with those kinds of attack campaigns, which I did not. Somebody way back there? Yeah, go ahead. Well, can we have reasonably sane civil discourse? The answer is yes, but after Election Day. No, I mean, I just, look, and I don't want to make this one-sided, but if one side has decided, as it has, that the way you win elections is to savage the other guy, and if the guy that's the object of the savaging has to have a strategy for dealing with that, which I repeat, one has to have, then these are going to be very contentious. Now, this is nothing new in American history. I mean, those of you who are students of American history, I mean, right after 1789, it was brutal. I mean, the newspapers of the time didn't even make a pretense of being objective. They were strictly partisan stuff. Jefferson, when he left the White House after 2 terms, said, "At last I will not have to put up with the jackals of the press." There were hints that he had a black mistress. Turned out to be true, although she was 75% white. Nobody was as vilified as Abraham Lincoln. Nobody. Now, what's the difference? Well, it's pictures, it's television, it's the internet, it's that stuff. I mean, you can attack an attack with impact far more effectively with visual images than with just print stuff. But it's not as if we haven't had savage campaigns in this country from the beginning of the Republic. But, you know, if a campaign decides it's going to engage in that kind of thing, then, as I said to you, the other side, regrettably, has got to deal effectively with it. And there are ways, as I've suggested, you can do that. But I do think this, once we elect a president, most Americans want to give that person a chance. And if that president can then begin to set a tone for reasonable discourse, I think we'll get it. I think we'll get it. Now, don't get me wrong. There will still be people on the edge who will, I mean, as Clinton discovered, I mean, from the day he was in office, there was this organized kind of effort to discredit him, discredit Hillary, all that kind of stuff. But I think people will be ready for that. And, of course, part of it has to do with the president, in this case himself. I mean, will he be that kind of person who will encourage that kind of dialogue and reach out to people and try to build consensus and coalitions and so on. If that happens, I think most Americans will respond to that. I mean, we're ready for that. I think we're sick of what we've been getting over the past 8 years, frankly. But time will tell. Yeah? It's a lot better than what we've been experiencing.
Tell me if it's November 5th and Swarthmore has a dark cloud over it because McCain has been elected. Like, what would you want me to hear to continue?
Well, you know, I'm going to be 75 in November. I feel about 35, but I'm going to be 75. So I've had the experience of going through these ups and downs. The first thing I can say to you, and it's a repetition of what I've already said to you, is that there are lots and lots of ways, no matter who is in the White House, where you could make a serious contribution to improving this country and its political dialogue and so on. I urge you to do so. Now, sometimes, hey, I was governor when Reagan was president. That was kind of distressing, to put it mildly, you know. But I said, well, okay, you know, I'll work with Democrats in the Congress, and we'll go to work here in little old Massachusetts, and we'll try to do the kind of job that I hope people will not only expect of us, but will respond to positively. And I was able to do that, even though we had an administration in the White House that was very, very uninspiring, to put it mildly. Then, of course, I got so bad at them and at what was going on, I decided to run for the presidency. Failed to do so. But there are lots and lots of opportunities. You know, one of the advantages of the federal system, if I may say, is that there's a certain amount of diffusion of responsibility and authority out there. So people at state and local level can do lots and lots of very good things, notwithstanding who's in the White House. But believe me, it would be wonderful to have somebody in the White House who reflected what I think is best about this country and could get us out of this stupid war and begin to restore our position and our prestige in the world, who understands, as Yitzhak Rabin understood, that you can't make peace unless you talk to your enemies, folks. And by the way, that's not just me talking, or even Rabin. The president appointed something called the Iraq Study Commission. Remember that? 6 Republicans, 6 Democrats, headed up by his father's Secretary of State and a highly respected former Democratic congressman named Lee Hamilton. Robert Gates was on it. Unanimously said, what, get out of there and start talking to the Syrians and the Iranians. Well, that's not going to happen if John McCain is president of the United States. It will happen if Barack Obama is president of the United States. So I'm with you. I mean, I want to wake up on the first Wednesday in November and say, wow, you know, the cloud is lifted. But if it doesn't, find your spot at some level. And we're probably going to have a Democratic Congress, so at least we can work with those folks. But it would be lovely if we had a president of Congress working together who you and I could respect and admire. But don't get depressed. Lots of opportunities to do things at other levels. Yeah?
Did you see the movie Swing Vote?
Did I see the movie Swing Vote?
Well,
no, I saw the movie, what's the last movie Kitty and I saw? The hell, Woody Allen. What was the name of that thing? Yeah, what'd you think of that? I was bored out of my mind. Am I getting old? Kitty and I turned to each other and said, what is this? Whatever happened? And this was supposed to be Woody Allen at his best. Woody Allen was back. Anyway, yeah, Swing Vote. Well, having not seen the movie, I can't quite grasp what exactly they were. Look, if you're going to win an election, you've clearly got to deal with this media stuff. But to repeat for the third time, you've got to be working down there where people are. You've got to do both. And you better tell the truth. McCain has had a very bad last 10 days. Have you noticed? Why? Because they started running ads on Obama that just were not truthful. This business about how Obama was for comprehensive sex education beginning in kindergarten, just Absolutely, absolutely false. Absolutely false. And he's in trouble now because of that. I mean, the campaign is really kind of getting into trouble. There's been a number of these kinds of things. So being truthful is a very important part of this. Run for political office. Don't start engaging in untruths. You're going to get into big trouble. It's my view. And that doesn't mean you can't be tough and you can't be forceful. But don't get into that stuff. It's a mistake. Yeah. You thought it was good? What was the name of it? I've even forgotten the name. Yeah, Vicky Cristina Barcelona. Well, I'll tell you, there must be a generational divide here. But here, hey, I like Mamma Mia, you know, so what can I tell you? I don't know. Anyway, go ahead. Of course, the setting was a lovely island in Greece, so you see there was a kind of a, yeah, I'm sorry, go ahead. Well, they heard this drill baby drill stuff, and they didn't exactly collapse because there were a lot of safeguards there, including, by the way, a provision in the House bill that they can't drill off of George's Bank off New England. For those of you who know, one of the richest fishing grounds in the world, far more important than a few more cups of gasoline. But I think she heard from her membership who were getting pressure because people said, why don't we drill? Now, the United States Department of Energy, the Bush United States Department of Energy, has definitively said that drilling will not reduce the price of gasoline 1 cent, now and in the future, which is an accurate statement. Why do we stand up and do that? Just the way Obama stood up during the primary and said, come on, cutting the gasoline tax, are you serious? And by the way, I thought he scored with that, didn't you? It was Hillary and McCain who took the heat over that thing, and rightly so. But you know, why have the Democrats get, well, now, they've combined it with legislation to provide real incentives for alternative energy and that kind of stuff, which they couldn't get through this filibuster thing. And the hope is that by conceding under certain, by the way, the state, you know, has to approve, the governor has to approve and so forth. Schwarzenegger's against offshore drilling, so if he doesn't approve, and I suspect my governor would do the same, won't happen anyway. But I agree, you know, they felt some pressure and decided, for whatever reason, they had to give a little bit on that issue. I wouldn't have voted for the bill because I just think it's a fraud. I mean, we got to get off this fossil fuel thing and start getting serious about alternative sources. Yeah, way in the back. Yeah. What about the draft? What about mandatory service? I don't think we need a draft at this point in time. On the other hand, if we keep getting involved in war after war after war, we're going to need it. Now, as I said to you, I think invading Iraq probably will go down in history as the dumbest decision we've ever made in the history of American foreign policy. I mean, and by the way, with serious implications for the Afghanistan thing, which was far more legitimate. I mean, I think you know what's happened there. I mean, we just shortchanged our effort in Afghanistan because we diverted all these resources to Iraq. Where was I? Now, what about national service? I'm not sure I think national service ought to be mandatory because if you force people to do this stuff, you're going to get a lot of folks don't want to do it. On the other hand, I'd like to see lots and lots of opportunities for you guys to do national service. And we have many, but I'd like to see it expanded with significant educational benefits going along with your service. I think it makes all kinds of sense. A president who really wants to encourage that could do so. I think we made a good start under Clinton. It's kind of slowed down a bit under this guy, but I think there are great opportunities. And by the way, I would encourage lots of you to do that. You know, a lot of my students are now going in to teach for America. A lot of my students doing a lot of this kind of stuff, and I think it's terrific. So, not sure I'm for mandated national service, but I certainly want to see lots and lots of opportunities for you guys to do this if you want to. Yeah. What do I think of Sarah Palin? I don't know Sarah Palin.
Neither do we.
I can tell you this, if I haven't said this already, if Barack Obama had selected a running mate who had been a governor for a year and a half, the Republican Party would have been savaging him from here to the west and back. I mean, you know, I think on the record, it's just, but I don't know anything about her. I think, as I've said to you, I think she deserves some credit for taking on her own party establishment in Alaska, but I don't know where is she on some of the great issues? What does she want to do here? I mean, where is she on health care? Does she think all working people and their families ought to be guaranteed basic health insurance in the United States? And if so, how's she going to do that? And if not, why not? I think that's kind of a fundamental issue, don't you think? In 2008, when every other advanced industrialized nation in the world not only provides its citizens with comprehensive health insurance with better health outcomes than ours, but does so, are you ready for this, at half the cost per capita we're spending on health care. I mean, that's really amazing, isn't it? Where is she on this? I don't know. Alaska has the worst high school graduation rate in the country. What's she done about it? Of all the states, worst in the country. Now, there may be reasons for that, but what's she done about that? Said some very impressive things about kids with disabilities, as a child with severe disabilities herself, but I don't know if anything in the Palin record suggests that she's done anything as governor to deal with kids with disability, kids with autism, kids with certain forms of retardation, and so on and so forth. I think the record's kind of devoid. So, and she, you know, as I think I said here, she's absolutely the queen of earmarks. I mean, no state of the country is in for more earmarks than the state of Alaska. So, and by the way, speaking of earmarks, you know, McCain goes on and on about earmarks, but a $10 billion a month earmark for Iraq doesn't seem to bother him. There's a certain inconsistency there, don't you think? I mean, he's talking about $18 billion in earmarks annually in the U.S. budget. That's 2 months in Iraq, folks. So there we are. But I don't know much about her. I don't think most Americans know much about her, which is part of the problem. Anybody way in the back? Yeah. When you're governor, you get yourself elected governor of Massachusetts, where the number of Republicans in the legislature is so small. It's really not a problem. I mean, your problem is with warring Democratic factions. We have so many of them. I mean, we have a state Senate of 40, and I think there may be 6 Republicans. We have a House of 160, and there may be 20. Now, it's not that I shunned these folks, you know, I tried to be courteous and stuff, but it's wonderful. It's wonderful. And although my first term was a disaster when it came to the legislative relationship, and that was as much my fault as anybody, partly because I was a young reformer. You know, I had a reputation being the leader of the Young Turks in the legislature. My poor father, you know, when he'd read that his son, his Greek-American son, was a leader of the Young Turks, it used to bother him, although he was born and brought up in Western Turkey. So there we are. But the party establishment at that time really disliked me intensely and did everything they could to stop me from being governor. Well, then I got defeated. Defeat is a teacher. I learned a lot from that defeat, and I came back. I was a much better governor the second time around and had a much better legislative relationship the second time around because I worked at it. And even though it was overwhelmingly Democratic, both times, what made the difference? I reached out to my colleagues in the legislature, brought them into the process early, made them an important part of the process, made sure that the folks that worked for me treated them with respect, which they deserved. And we had a terrific relationship. We got all kinds of stuff done. A lot of this it's all about coalition building, folks. It's all about reaching out to people, bringing them into the process. And by the way, even though I didn't have a lot of Republicans in the legislature, there were conservative constituencies out there who I tried to bring into the process as constructively as I could. I mean, I signed a universal health care bill when I was governor, which required all employers with 6 or more employees to insure their employees. And we were well on our way to implementing it when I left office and a fellow named Weld took over. And Bill Weld just did everything he could to screw that up successfully. And so the bill that I signed was never implemented, but I got it through with significant business support. Isn't that amazing? No, it's not amazing. If you're a business person and you believe it's important that you insure your employees and their families, and you're paying these days $12,000 or $13,000 a year for that per employee, and there's a guy down the street competing with you that's not doing that, then you're at a competitive disadvantage because you're doing the right and responsible thing. Why isn't the business community in this country arguing strenuously for an employer mandate covering all or at least most employers in their own self-interest. Well, I happen to have a business guy who was a Republican, but who understood this. A fellow named Nelson Gifford. He ran something called the Dennison Manufacturing Company in those days. Most of you are too young to remember Dennison. Labels, notebooks, remember, old folks, Dennison? Out in Framingham, Massachusetts. Nelson Gifford understood this, and he was my ambassador to the business community, and he was terrific. Now, I don't know that Nelson Gifford ever voted for me. It's okay. But when it came to this issue, reaching out to him and through him to other responsible business people really made the difference. So you can build coalitions, believe me. I mean, I don't want to go on at great length. I mean, healthcare happens to be another one of my passions in life. But, and I'm a failed pre-med. You know what happened to me here? You know, all those, I came here, I'd done very well in high school, you know, biology, chemistry. I figured I was a tentative pre-med. I decided to take general physics. There's a piece of my brain, folks, marked physics, that's missing. The harder I worked, the worse I did. I ended up with a charitable D, and that was the end of my pre-medical career. In the meantime, I was having a wonderful time, political science, economics, and history, and the rest, as they say, is history. So you see? I mean, anyway, how did I get on that? We're about ready to quit. I'm getting the hook here.
Well, we're going to give him an A today, right?
Anyway, in any event, to wrap this up, and you've been a great audience, and I appreciate that. If you are in a position of political responsibility, you are uniquely able to reach out to people. Once I figured this out, after I'd got my head handed to me in 1978 and came back in '82, and every time we went down the policy road, we started by reaching out to as many people as we possibly could, friends and foes alike. And I don't remember, folks, anyone ever saying, screw you, Governor, I'm not coming, I won't participate. Americans don't do that. If they think the person that's asking them is serious about involving them. And you know, if you go out and take a poll tomorrow, folks, and ask the American people whether or not working people and their families ought to be guaranteed basic health insurance, what do you think the numbers would look like? Any idea? 93, 94, 95%. I mean, most people believe that Americans ought to have basic health security. And I don't mean with a $5,000 deductible either. So that's another reason, and let me conclude with this, why seeking political office and being in a position where you can really make a difference gives you a real opportunity to reach out to folks. Now, obviously, and I'll conclude with this, you know, I hope Obama's going to be the next president of the United States. I think this guy has unique coalition-building skills. I'm not naive about this. There will be folks from the right who will be coming at him from the day he gets elected. But I think the United States is ready for this, and I think he's got some very special skills and ability to do this. And I think life is going to be a lot more pleasant. But you got to get him elected first. So my final plea to all of you is this. Please, over the next 6 weeks, do everything you can to get as many people as you know, not just here in Pennsylvania, but all over the country, out in the street knocking on doors, will you? It's just 6 weeks. Stakes are very high. And get yourselves involved in public service and politics. You'll never regret it. Thanks. Thank you. Thank you.